I enjoy always to talk about, I would say, the derech hapsak, the approach of how our Poskim reach conclusions in halacha. And in the shul, it's been the tradition that when we start Pirkei Avos, we talk a little bit about whether Poskim have a right to infuse the halachic outcome with their personalities. If a posek is given more towards the milk of human kindness, does that get infused in his halachic decision, or is it pedantic, rigorous halacha? So recently I read an article, I mentioned it, but I recently read an article that was published in a journal called Netuim. It's an Israeli journal, and it was published in volume 17. And it was a discussion by a professor who was giving an appreciation of Rabbi Elyashiv. I think it was a little bit, some short time after his death, after his patira. And this individual was discussing probably one of the biggest halachic minds that we've had in a very long time, one of the greatest halachic minds. And he talked about skimming through all his halachic positions and a lot of his decisions, and he never saw anything remotely resembling personality in them. Never was there a child's birthday, never was there a discussion of a death of a relative, never was there any comment to the eye, to the flesh and blood, to the bones, to the guts of the individual. Everything was clear, just meticulous halacha. And he said it was very evident in the structure of how Rabbi Elyashiv ruled. When he felt that shaitels were impermissible, it didn't matter if many women would have to throw out thousands and thousands of dollars worth of shaitels. They were not permissible. He was extremely focused on the outcome, and he had no capacity for mercy. This is what this individual writes. And the truth is, recently my son shared with me a video that was online of Rabbi Elyashiv receiving his son-in-law, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, two gedolei hador, two of the biggest people that we've had in a very long time. And it was Sukkot, and Rav Chaim came to visit Rabbi Elyashiv in his sukkah. And it's an amazing sight to behold. If anybody's interested, maybe afterwards I'll put it on WhatsApp through Rabbi Akiva, and I'll share it with you. But it's the most amazing sight to behold. And maybe you wouldn't understand it. It's Yiddish and it's a little bit muffled, but I could just give you a bit of a blow-by-blow, a description of what happens over there, just to give you an understanding of who Rabbi Elyashiv was. So Reb Chaim walks in. He comes in first alone. This is his son-in-law. They're both gedolei hador. And he sits down. Rabbi Elyashiv is already well in his 90s. He's closer to 100 than to 90. And he's sitting, he looks at him, he barely says hello. He seems slightly amused, but nothing more. And they're looking at each other, and they might even be at a loss of what to say for a few minutes. And then Rabbi Elyashiv opens up and says, "What about your book on Kotchim? Where are you holding with that?" And Rabbi Chaim says, "Well, I'm nearing the end of Zvachim. I'm working. We'll get there soon." Quiet for another few minutes. Then Rabbi Chaim looks at the pictures and he says, "Is there not a Shabbos problem or a Yom Tov problem with writing that is under the pictures?" He's referencing a Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Memtes, Ksav Shemahalach Tachas Adiyukan Osir, which is to read writing under a picture is not permissible on Shabbos. And Rabbi Elyashiv thinks for a second. He says, "No," he says, "it's not a problem. Everybody knows what's written under the pictures and nobody's really reading it. It's okay. It's just writing. It's not a problem at all." Another few seconds of silence, and Rav Chaim is brought a cup of tea. They're mechabed Rav Chaim with a cup of tea, and somebody says it has no sugar. They meant to say it has saccharin, and Rabbi Elyashiv says it has no sugar. You can't make a bracha. It's regular water. What are you giving them a tea without sugar? And Rav Chaim says you can't make a bracha on a tea without. From subject to subject, the discussion is strictly learning. And it's encompassing different interesting areas of learning. And that's what these men are alive in. There's nothing of how you're feeling, how you're doing, what's doing with the kids. It's where's your book on Kotchim? What about the pictures? What about the tea? Do you make a blessing? Do you not make a blessing? This is how this individual connects. Then his daughter comes in. She's one of the most amazing individuals, such a warm person. She's effusive with every type of warmth. Her name was Batsheva Esther Kanievsky. Just this week, the Lamnas had a baby. Last week they had a baby, but this week they named her Batsheva Esther, and they named her for Rav Chaim Kanievsky's wife. Really a wonderful woman. She comes in, and again, she's warm, and she says, "Was machst du, Tata?" And he looks up, and he says, "Good, good, everything's good." And again, the way she connects is she says to him, "When's your shiur?" He says, 8:30. Before Ma'ariv, after Ma'ariv. That's the connection. She sits down, and she wants to have something to say. So she tells her father an interesting story. She says, a neighbor of ours, she says, just told us that he went to Shul Yom Kippur morning, and he has an aquarium in his house. He has a fish tank. And he watched how the fish all lined up by the Mizrach side of the aquarium, and they stood there like that. And his wife told him they stood there like that for a whole day. They didn't budge until he came home after Ne'ilah. Then they started swimming around. And she tells her father with a glint in her eye, "You think it's Emas Adin? You think the fish knew it's Yom Kippur?" And you see Rabbi Yashiv has no interest in this. He says, maybe ask the fish. I have no idea. I don't know. He looks at Rav Chaim. He says, "What do you think about the fish?" And he says, I don't know. This is a man who knows everything. He's never at a loss for anything regarding halacha. About the fish, I don't know. So, again, this understanding of Rami Reiner, this professor who wrote him up in Netuim, volume 17, seems somewhat accurate, that the halacha is just the strict sentiment of what the book says, how to interpret the law, how to work the words into the law, and that's it and no more. Well, then somebody rebuts him and says, no, it's not true. And the rebuttal is a very strong rebuttal, and the rebuttal is what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. He says, always the Poskim had very strong feeling involved in their halachic psak. Always the Poskim were very, very warm towards the people that were asking them questions. Recently I read, and I'll just give you a few examples, and then we'll go through some famous halachic positions that were interesting. But this rebutter to Reiner's article, he says, it's not true. He says, Poskim have to be sympathetic. They were always sympathetic. That was always the approach. The approach is not just cold, cruel halacha. So, and he proves it through many, many different ways. But one very basic proof was the fact that we find that the Ramah wrote a sefer, and the name of the sefer was Teras Chatas. And it's a book mostly on Issa V'Heter, on Yeridea, and it works through the different laws and the different positions. Often, the Ramah takes a very lenient view. The Ramah's leniency finds itself b'makam hefsed, when there's loss or when there's guests and the pot not being able to be eaten will cause a tremendous amount of discomfort, or if it's Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif. And the Ramah was very, very fixated on those concepts being vehicles to allow the halacha to sometimes be wiggled about. So much so that the Maral's older brother of Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg wrote a sefer, and that sefer was called Vikuach Mayim Chaim, which means the debate of fresh water. And what it was a refutation, for the most part, against the Ramah, who he felt took very strong leniency, using these concepts with frequency that he didn't feel was applicable to halacha. So again, the Vikuach Mayim Chaim was the pedantic adherent to words, adherent to concepts, whereas the Ramah was the, we would say, soft, approachable Paisik, who knew how to wiggle the halacha around certain times of need. And I always point out, today we know the Ramah, we know the Teres Chatas. He's the Rebbe of Klal Yisrael. He's the one that teaches everybody halacha. Most people do not know who the Vikuach Mayim Chaim is. Even though it's a very important contribution to halacha, most people do not know who it is. I point out also, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, I once read a story about him, which was it was so revealing, the essence of this individual. It was a couple of weeks before he died. And a man came into his house. Shlomo Zalman was already quite weak. And he said, listen, I have a situation. He says, my personal situation is like this. I was married to a woman, We lived, me and my wife, for many years. We took care of my wife's disabled sister. I never had children with my wife. Now my wife died, he says. I don't want to throw my disabled sister-in-law out in the street. But there's a problem. I can't be with her. I'm not married to her. It's yichud. So I've been living outside of the apartment, coming in to check on her. My solution is, he says, I'm a man in my mid-50s. I'm willing to marry her just so I could take care of her. My question is, am I obligated to do that? Or should I put her in a home and see if I could try to find myself a wife and maybe have children? Am I obligated to do that? Is that my obligation as somebody who took care of this woman for most of her adult life? Is that my chiyuv? So Zalman listens and he starts crying and he says, wow, what a great man you are. What a tzaddik. And he's so overwhelmed by the guy. And then he looks at him and he says, I can't answer you. To get into such a question, I have to walk your walk. I have to wear your clothes. I have to feel your emotions. It's a big question. I'm too weak. I'm too sick. I don't feel I have the capacity to give you the right emotional answer for such a deeply emotional question. That's what I'm saying. Go to a younger posek, somebody with the emotional quotient to get into your situation. That's what Rav Shlomo Zalman told him. And I also recall, I've said this over in shul many times, Reb Shmuel Salant, who was the very venerable posek of Yerushalayim, he lived till 105, used to look far and wide for any type of leniency that he was able to in order to make something kosher. And once a poor butcher came in with a lung that seemingly was problematic, and Rav Shmuel looked, he turned it over, he hit the svarim for hours until he finally allowed the guy to, he said, it's kosher, it's not a problem. When his Talmidim looked at him and they said, Rebbe, why couldn't you make a treif? I mean, this was really skirting the law. He says, there's a Beis Yosef that gives a problem with this specific lung. The Ramah doesn't like it. Why were you so... He says, listen. He says, I'm an old man. He says, I'm nearing 100. He says, I'm going to soon meet many people up there. He says, I'd rather face the Beis Yosef and the Ramah, and I'll tell them what I did and why I did what I did, and I'm good, I'm comfortable with the back and forth that I'll have with them. He says, I, God forbid, do not want to meet the ox or the possibility of the casualties that this treif could make. I'll have nothing to say to them. I'll just look with my open hands and I won't have an answer. He says, I'd rather meet the Poskim than meet the dead ox. And another story with Shmuel Salant, which I always felt very inspired by. It's a famous story. A woman walked in, she was a poor lady, she had just made a chicken soup, and one of her kids accidentally dropped a half a cup of milk in the soup, and this was all they had to eat that night. And she said, I know the law, it has to be 60, and it isn't. We don't have that much soup, and we don't have that much chicken, and I can't afford to throw this out. What should I do? And Shmuel Salant is tossing it in his mind. He says, chicken isn't meat. Maybe we could be lenient because it's not really a direct. But she says there was definitely not 60 times the amount of soup as the cup of milk. She says to her, listen, lady, come back in 45 minutes. I'll have an answer for you. I think it's going to be okay. He thinks for a second. He calls the dairyman. He calls the milchika, the guy who gives out milk in Yerushalayim. And he asks him to please come, and he wants to have a little chat with him. He sits down. He doesn't hit him directly, and he doesn't make him uncomfortable. He gets into a conversation with him. He says, do you know that it's very smart nowadays to put some water in the milk? It's healthy for people to have diluted milk. The straight solid milk is not good for them. Maybe he said it clogs the arteries. Who knows what kind of words he used. And the milkman is listening. He says, Rebbe, are you kidding? My milk is not even milchik. It's almost all water. He says, I put more than half of it is water. And Shmuel Salant gives him a kiss and he says, oh, thank you so much. Unbelievable. The lady walks in and he says, it's fine. Don't let it happen again. Don't put milk in your soup, but it's fine. Don't ask me why. It's fine. That's it. Poskim were always very involved in the emotional needs of the people that were coming in front of them. And just before I go into some of the cases, I can't resist. I want to share with you a story from another interesting Jew. This was a grandson of Shadal, Shmuel David Lutzato, a relative of the Ramchal. He was the son of a woman whose name was, I think, Henrietta Cohen Lutzato, a Jewish woman who met an Italian man in Arizona, and his name was Enrico LaGuardia. Together they had a son named Fiorello LaGuardia, who I'm sure by now you understand was a Jew. He was a grandson of Shadal, he was a relative of the Ramchal, and he definitely, besides being an unbelievable mayor, he started off as a conservative, became a libertarian, ultimately he was an independent, but he was a phenomenal mayor with great vision, but he definitely had the milk of human kindness that flowed through his veins. And one very interesting story about him is during the time of the Depression. He won right about the time of the Depression. During the time of the Depression, him being a lawyer, he would double up sometimes and go into court and act as a judge for night court. Now, it happened once that a woman was brought in front of him, and she had stolen some corn and some loaves of bread. She was arrested, and she was brought in for some sort of a penalty. And he looked and he said, "Why'd you do what you did?" And she burst out into tears. She said, "Why did I do what I did? I have 3 kids that are starving at home. I don't have a husband. We're almost on the verge of death. Why did I do what I did? Who wouldn't do what I did?" He says, "You're right." And he starts crying with her. And then he looks around and it's a crowded courtroom. This was something of an activity. People like to see him. Apparently he was flamboyant disseminator of justice. And people look at him and he says, look. He says, "You got to pay the $5. There's a $5 fine. You got to pay the $5. And she's on the verge of screaming, $5? I haven't seen that. Don't worry, he says. And he pulls out a cord and he says, "I'm going to pass the hat around over here and everybody's going to contribute at least a quarter." He says, "Because what kind of society are we that we allow a person like you to starve and to be hauled into court like this to pay a penalty and we stand by with folded arms?" He says, "It's ridiculous. We all have to carry this burden." By the time it was done, there was $50 in the hat. He took the $5 for the sitting. He says, "Lady, take the $45, it's yours." So this was definitely a very kind gesture, and this was really what our Poskim were all about. And so what I'd like to say is like this, is that, and also it's interesting, in the Hakdama of the Har Tzvi, they found a lot of tshuvas later on, after Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank passed away. They found a lot of tshuvas on Even Ezer. And a lot of them dealt with agunis, women whose husbands were lost in battle, women whose husbands never came back from the War of Independence, from the Nazi era. And Rav Frank used to have to work very hard to try to find leniencies to allow these women to get married again. And he was very good at it. He always found very good loopholes. There was a bridge that collapsed, it was dynamited, and 14 people were killed, and they were destroyed beyond recognition, and women needed a heter. It wasn't clear which men went to the bridge. Rav Frank was very instrumental in finding the heterim over there. And it's in the notebook that was found where all these things were written, and eventually they were published in Har Tzvi, Even Ezer. Right on the top of the notebook, he quotes a Yerushalmi in Baba Kama, Perek Ches, Mishnah, Perek Ches Halacha Zayin. The Yerushalmi says, "Kol hamerachem al abriyas HaKadosh Baruch Hu merachem alav." And that's what he wrote. Anybody who has mercy on people, Hashem will have mercy on him. Mercy is a very important vehicle. And then he goes on to explain. He says, mercy doesn't mean to tell a person it's permissible when it isn't, to tell a person kosher when it's treif. Mercy means depriving yourself and putting yourself into that person's box and situation, walking miles in their shoes, recognizing how they feel and what exactly is going through their system, and then you'll be able to find the necessary formula to be matir and to give them the ability to go on and to get married. It's not about prevarication. It's about deprivation, self-deprivation, and putting yourself in their mind and recognizing what's necessary of you. And he was a very warm Posek, and he often came up with a very good Solomonic position that helped women and was very, very committed to the halacha. Now, the interesting point is that sometimes this concept of having Rahmanis goes, I would say, above and beyond and is not halachic. And it's dangerous. So we started off explaining that one mahalach in halacha, at least the way Rav Elyashiv was described, is very pedantic, methodical, and focused on the words without any dispensation for human emotion. We then went on to explain that it doesn't seem like that's the dominant majority of how Poskim approach things. It seems like most of the Poskim do approach things with a certain chut shel chesed. They do approach things with a teras chesed al l'shainam. So what I want to show is that sometimes the teras chesed goes a little too far and could be very dangerous. And in a journal that was published in the late 1800s, it was a Haskalah journal. It was called Hamelitz. It was published by a man named Alexander Sederbaum, who was a brilliant man, and he gave a platform for all the Russian intellectuals and the Polish intelligentsia to write whatever it is they wanted to write. And very often Rabbanim would also put positions there that sometimes skirted halacha. And there was an interesting Rav who came from Pittsburgh. His name was Rav Avram Yitzchak Olschwanger. I don't know much about him, but I did read this article that he wrote in the Hamelitz. I think it's Journal 23. And in the Hamelitz, he writes that the way he understands it, based on a Tosfos in Sanhedrin Daf Chavav, his understanding is that all the Jews, now let me explain. In America, during the late 18s and early 19s, all the way up to the 40s, it was impossible for a Jew to keep Shabbos and be employed by a company. They had no concept of taking off on Saturday. And in fact, there were people, I know of a specific individual that I heard had his whole living room decorated with pink slips. These were all the firing statements that he got every week after he worked for 5 days. When he told them he's leaving Shabbos, they pink slipped him. And he asked that when he died, he wanted to be buried with all these, as he thought this would be a perfect ticket to get into Bezdin Shalmaila. And probably it was. My grandfather, my own great-grandfather, Ellis Dubin, of blessed memory, he couldn't work for a boss because he was fired every Friday. He started his own knish factory. My grandmother is the baker and the famous creator of Mom's Knishes, and that was because my grandfather couldn't be a Shomer Shabbos and be employed by somebody else. He had to be self-employed. Ultimately, during the Depression, when he pushed a Knish pushcart, he was able to employ 3 of his brothers who lost their jobs working for firms that weren't Shomer Shabbos. Now, so this individual, Rav Avram Yitzchak Olschwanger, writes in the Hamelitz, based on a Tosfos in Sanhedrin Daf Chavav, that he believes, Tosfos writes over there that, I'm not going to go through the whole sugya, but Tosfos discusses over there that there is a possibility that Rav Yanai told people to plant their fields during Shemitah. And even though Shemitah, the sabbatical, the 7th year that the land has to lay fallow, which is a doiraisa, it's something God wants, Rav Yanai told them to plant anyhow because Rav Yanai felt that the king is going to look for his tax, he's going to want his grain allotment, and people won't have it, and he'll put them in prison, and it could be a sakana. So that, he says, allows people to plant on Shemitah even though you're not allowed to do it by Torah law. So Rabbi Olschwanger took this and he said, to him it would seem that if Rav Yanai allowed people to plant on Shemitah, then people in America could go to work on Shabbos. They should try to minimize and not do many malachas if they don't have to, minimize the best that they can, but they could go and provide a parnasa, because otherwise, what's the alternative? The alternative is going to be hunger. Their kids are going to starve. Their wives are going to starve. Just like Shemitah was allowed to be violated, so too Shabbos is allowed to be violated. Obviously, it would be better if you only do derabbanans, and I think at some point somebody suggested there would be a way to do derabbanans, but this was his idea. When the Netziv read this, it's interesting, obviously the Netziv read the Hamelitz. When the Netziv read this, he was furious. And he said, I saw something, a horrible thing, and he doesn't even quote, he doesn't mention who the rabbi is. He says, I saw a terrible thing in the pages of Hamelitz. And he goes on to take it apart brick by brick and to show that famine, where a person subjects himself to not having food, might not be pikuach nefesh. He argues it's definite Gemara rayas, and it's a raya from Reish Nun Beis and Hilchos Pidyon Shvuyim. Interesting rayas that the Netziv brings. I would say, reading the Tshuvas and Chelik Beis, Tshuva Nun Zayin, it's not such conclusive proof against Rabbi Olschwanger, but definitely the Netziv's position is there's no Shabbos violation. If you violate the Shabbos, we have nothing. If you violate the Shabbos, we'll have no future. We'll have no religion. We're not going to be a people. It's impossible to do that. So obviously, the Netziv was very committed to the fact that no, this can't be, and he dismantled the tshuva brick by brick, piece by piece. It's interesting that another individual by the name of Chaim Hershenson, Rav Chaim Hershenson was an individual who was born in the 1860s in Yerushalayim, the strong Yerushalmi family, but he was a maverick, he was a strong independent, and he was zoich at the age of 30 to be put in cherem by Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld for his streak of radical independence, so he had to leave Eretz Yisrael, and he moved to America. I think he was a Rav in Hoboken. He wrote a number of svarim, a lot of svarim. Amongst them is a sefer called Malki B'Kodesh. It's a set of responsa. It's 4 volumes, 4 or 5 volumes. And in volume number 2, page 143, he goes out to defend Rav Avram Yitzchak Olschwanger, and he takes apart the Netziv's proof one by one, showing that Rabbi Olschwanger is right, and we should be much more kind to what was known then as the Shomerei Shabbos minyan, which was a minyan with people coming in Shabbos morning at 8 o'clock, davening very quickly, and then going off to work, making a parnasa. He says we should be much more kinder and much more understanding of them. Now, the truth is that this was mercy that was beyond the call and beyond the pale of what we as Jews would hold reasonable. This was wrong, and look, the reality is those that did not keep the Shabbos, those that went on to work on Shabbos, they ended up not keeping kosher from families. A lot of their children intermarried. You barely recognize that they're Jewish today. Yet all the families that kept Shabbos and that paid dearly for it, a lot of their families are very big Talmidei Chachamim, occupy big positions in yeshivas and great spots of leadership, and nobody died from hunger because they were fired every Friday. In fact, it might have been the cause for many Jewish businesses. It might have been the cause for a great, I would say, financial boom by Jews when they realized they couldn't rely on anybody other than their own. They couldn't rely on people. They had to do everything themselves. So the truth is that this concept of Rav Hershenson and Rav Olschwanger, you could clearly say was wrong. The Netziv said it was wrong. It was clearly much more than the Rachmanis that we should be, much more than the Rachmanis that is, I would say, that halacha is soivel, much more than the Rachmanis that halacha could bear. So what I want to say is, it's the halacha body is sort of dictated by people on both sides. That means you have, and it's very important, it's part of the whole mosaic of how halacha gets disseminated, of our Mesorah. You have people that are very strong and they're methodical and they read words and they interpret words, and they're the Rebbe Yashivs, and the people who are very, very committed to Vos Shteit. Not always does Klal Yisrael adopt their psak. And you have the people who are extremely, I would say, the milk of human kindness flows through every word in their halachic position. And not always does Klal Yisrael accept their psak. But somewhere in the middle, the amalgam of these two schools of thought is the emes and the shalom, the emes v'ashalom ha'evu. The amalgam of these two schools of thought is the shuras ha'halacha that keeps us going. The concept of halacha is a concept of halacha, hiluch, holech, yelech. That's the concept. This concept that allows us to continue walking in the right path with the light of the Torah shining on it is the amalgam between these two great positions. And both of them are essential components to how we as Jews walk throughout the ages. one more example I'd like to give and close with a small nekuda is there was a great posek. His name was Reb Aaron Levine. He was a Rav in Sambor, which was a city in Galicia. He was killed in the Holocaust at the age of 61 in 1941. He had a son. His son was Dr. Yitzchak Levine. Dr. Yitzchak Levine was a great scholar of the Holocaust. He ended up escaping and he died in 1995. He was the author of a very famous set of books called agadah, 7 volumes, and it is a memoriam of great villages, towns, and people in pre-war Europe. It's just one big ode of tragedy and sadness, agadah, but it's a very important piece of work. What Rabbi Aaron Levine was a very famous, great big posek, and he wrote a sefer amongst other svarim, but one of his famous svarim was Shailas Tshuvas Avnei Tzedek. And in the Avnei Tzedek, he has an interesting tshuva. And this is, I would say, a wrinkle or part of a larger discussion. It's in the I'll just give you a little akdama. In the Magen Avram, in the beginning of Hilchos Shabbos, he brings down the Shailas Tshuvas Tzemach Tzedek, Siman Chof Ches. There was a discussion where the fishmongers in the town of Nicholsburg were charging a tremendous amount of money for the fish. And they hiked the price, knowing that Jews would pay regardless of what you would ask. Jews would always pay. So the question was, and fish was important for Jews on Shabbos. Gemara on Shabbos, Daf Kuf Yud Ches, Kuf Yud Tes, you have to be mechaber with kosa deharsana. Fish is very important. So the question was what to do. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, if they're taking advantage of our need, we're going to ban fish for a few weeks, a few months, until they recognize that they can't take advantage of us. And this is something that's agreed upon by the Magen Avram right in the beginning of Hilchos Shabbos. He sees fit to bring this down, that if the akuma miyakrim is shara dogim, if they're charging too much for the fish, don't buy fish. This was repeated again during the big polemic of Esrogim that came from Corfu, the island of Corfu, which is a Crete island, where they were charging, the cartel made up to charge an exorbitant amount of money, and the Esrogim were priced out of the Jews' ability to buy it, and some Rabbanim made up not to buy those Esrogim anymore. In different times, in different circumstances, there were Rabbanim that got up to create a boycott when things were overpriced. Now, interestingly, in the town of Sambor, where the Avnei Tzedek was a Rav, it seems that when Sukkot was coming, this was in the 1920s, and it was right after the war and World War I, and people were broke, and the Sukkot was arriving, and all the people that were providing schach decided to charge a fortune for bamboo. That was the only schach that was available. They had imported bamboo, and they charged a tremendous amount. And they made up amongst themselves that nobody gets bamboo for a lower price. So the people didn't have an eitzah. There were no trees in the town. It was a very muddy, dried out town. The only place that had trees, and lots of them, was a cemetery. The Jewish cemetery had lots of trees. Now, the problem is you can't cut down trees that are in the cemetery. It's a din in Yeridei, Siman Shin Samaches. If you cut down trees from a cemetery, you got to burn them. It's not something that you could have anah. The reason for that is because it belongs to the covet of the dead, and you took it, you're punished now. It's a fine, it's a penalty, it's a knas. You have to burn them, you can't use them. The question was, are Jews allowed to go and take trees from the cemetery? Well, there's a clear halacha. It says no. But the Rav of Sambor, Rav Aaron Levine, said, no, you can. And he, I would say, infused the Torah's chesed into his position. He says, listen, he says, the whole thing is because you don't want to be disrespectful to the dead. But the dead understand what's happening over here. And if they did understand, they would certainly feel respected by the fact that you're taking the schach. He says, in this case, I'm sure Chazal would have suspended this halacha. I'm allowing you to take it. He says, not only that, he brought a few interesting rulings. He says, schach, you don't have to have something that you have to that is permissible to have ano. It's just the concept of shade. As soon as you have the shade, it's okay. It doesn't matter if it's being shaded by a tree that you could have ano from or not have ano. He also said that in his position, his estimation, only trees that hang directly over graves. He says if you cut a lot of trees, in those trees you're going to have branches that are not directly over graves. They all become bottle, they all become mixed. He says I'm going to rely on bittul also. And in conclusion, he had a couple of other, I think 4 or 5, but the basic idea is the beauty of this psak and of this individual was he understood a need. He recognized the eis tzarech, a shasat chak, and he says, I'm going to help you out. You're going to have sukkahs. We're going to figure it out. We're going to make this mutter. This is what we're talking about, the concept of teras chesed al shayna. Definitely, in order to make sure that we don't go off and have psakim like the one in Hamelitz and the one that the Netziv has such a great difficulty with, we need Rabbi Yashiv and we need very strong darbonis, people that keep the halacha vehicle on the straight path and don't allow it to move off to the side. So we have the merciful and we have the super merciful that take the carriage off to the left, and we have the strong that keep it right in the middle. And just to conclude, I'd like to say that I was once recently, when Chasanis was still Chasanis and everybody was sitting near each other, I was by a wedding and a guy asked me, he says, he obviously wanted to tell me something, and he told me a nice word on Kol Nidre, which whatever, it's not for now. It was a nice word and maybe I'll share it a different time. But he wanted to know, why is everybody so moved by Kol Nidre? What's the emotional punch that Kol Nidre gives everyone? What's the big deal? Do I know something on it? So I told him, I said, I read once that we start al das hamokim, al das hakol, anu matirim lispalel lima'avaryonim. We start our Kol Nidre by allowing us to pray with the sinners. And it's something very interesting. And then we go off to Kol Nidre. All the vows that we made, they're not valid. And that's what we go into Yom Kippur with. I said, I once read that during the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when Moranos were forced to live as Catholics when they were outside, and then when they would come into their crypto gatherings, they would be complete Jews, and they would shed the facade of Catholicism, and they would come in and they'd want to daven like good frum Yidden. But you know what? They just ate chazah the whole year. They were eating pork. And they swore oaths of fealty to the king and oaths of fealty to the church, and they were completely presenting themselves as one that was connected and committed to the church. And they come in with their Jewish brethren who are not doing that, who are avoiding that somehow. And the Chazan looks at them and he says, but you made it here finally. And we're all one now. He says, listen, al das hamokim, al das hakol, we're making everything open. This is glasnost. We're opening everything. Anu matirim lispalel lima'avaryonim. We're allowed to pray with the sinners. There's no sinner tonight. We're all here begging for atonement. Tell me, you now understand why it's emotional? You now understand what's being said? You understand why people... And then we launch into Kol Nidre. Any vow you made to the church, any vow you made to a body of authority that's looking to kill you and to burn you at an order da fe, they're not vows, they're nothing. Just go in like a clean young baby, meet the Rabbi Shalom, and have a complete taharas hanefesh. So look, the milk of human kindness is so intense and so pervasive in one of our most important tefillas. This is where it comes from. Al das hakol, al das hamokim, al das hakol, anu matirim lispalel lima'avaryonim. Anyhow, thank you all for listening. I appreciate everybody. Be well.